welcome back to another video. If you are new here, my name is Jackie, and in today's video I'm going to be sharing a very special project with you guys. I am going to be sharing the process of making a baby quilt for my son, which we are expecting to be due this summer. I have like 2.5 more months left to go, so very soon he will be joining the family, and I wanted to make him a special blanket that will be kind of like his baby blanket. And I came across a creator who made a very similar 9-patch style baby quilt, and I was like, wow, that's so cute, and it really inspired me to try to make one of my own. I learned a lot along the way, and I wanted to share the process with you guys, so I did document some clips of each step of the way. And this is not going to be so much a tutorial, but you can definitely learn alongside of me. I'm going to link some resources below that I did also use that helped me with different techniques, like piecing the different patches together, doing the binding. I kind of pulled from a couple different resources. There's a couple things that I wanted to kind of preface before we actually get into the process. So firstly, I do want to say that I think it's a great way to start out a quilting or sewing project by creating a loose plan and vision of what you expect your end result to look like. So this way you kind of have a blueprint or like a guide to stick to along the way. And to do this, I started with my notes app, and I planned out the dimensions of how big I wanted the quilt to be. So I just kind of wrote down, and then from there I was able to break down how big each individual patch would be, and then how big each smaller square within the 9 patch would be. And then secondly, I also used Canva to create a like a visual of what I wanted the end result to look like. And I also used Canva to kind of like mess around with different color schemes or colorways to see like which colors I wanted to use. It took me about like a day or two to kind of think through those details. And then the actual process of creating the quilt and hand quilting and all of that took me about 2.5 weeks. So this was definitely a slower paced project that I took my time with, and I really used the margins of my day to work on this. So like late at night when the kids were down, or if I had some extra time during the weekend. But I was always really excited to work on it. So it definitely paid off, the end result, I'll say that. A little bit about the fabric. For this quilt, I used 100% linen for the fabric. For the color patches, I sourced that linen from a local fabric shop. And then for that base and kind of like the, I guess, yeah, like the base color, I used linen from a thrifted bed sheet that I had in my fabric stash from a long time ago. So that made it really easy to kind of like cut a big square, not have to like attach 2 pieces of fabric together to make the width of it, if that makes sense. And because this blanket is going to be used for a baby, I wanted to use natural fabrics just because they wash really well and just get softer over time. And once all the preparation was done, then I was able to start actually cutting into my fabric and start the actual quilting process. So wanted to give that little preface first before we jump into the video, but let's go ahead and make a baby quilt for my son. So just like with any other sewing project, you want to start off by pre-washing your fabric and then ironing out any creases and folds. And this just allows for you to have really nice clean edges when you're making cuts, especially for a quilting project. I'm using this rotary cutter and this mat and ruler that I actually got as a set from Amazon, and it was pretty affordable. So I really recommend getting something like this if you don't have it for quilting. And then I just cut my strips as you guys saw, and I did 2.5 inches for the width. And then once I completed that, I started sewing together those strips into 3s. So I did some that were yellow, white, yellow, and then I did some that were white, yellow, white. Here I am just kind of ironing flat the seams, and for this in particular, I ironed the seams towards the middle so that they could lay nice and flat and be kind of like nested together in the middle. Once I completed that, I began to cut these strips into smaller strips, and again I'm using the 2.5-inch measurements just to keep everything uniform. My next step was to iron out more of my base fabric so that I can cut some single colored squares that are going to alternate between the 9 patches, and then I use my iron to just make sure those were nice and crisp as well. I bought this wool mat from Amazon, and if you are quilting, I recommend getting something like this because it made it so much easier. Something kind of funny happened. So after about a day, I decided, you know what, I actually want to do the blue color instead of that yellow mustard color. So I repeated the entire process with the blue and the white instead of the yellow. And you'll see here, I am kind of piecing together what a 9 patch will look like with this color instead. Once I completed that, I started piecing together the solid colors with the 9 patch, and I just basically followed the blueprint that I had created, that I had mocked up on Canva, just so I could stick with the design that I wanted. And then I sewed everything together at a 1/4-inch seam allowance, and then from there I started sewing those rows together, and you'll see here I have my first 2 rows, which is very exciting. And then I completed the top quilt by sewing all 5 rows together, so I had like a 5x5 top quilt, and then I'm just using my iron again to flatten down the seam. For this part, I just split the seam in half and ironed it flat. And then I went ahead and started cutting my batting, and I placed my top quilt on top of it and measured about 6 inches or so around the edge of my top quilt just to give some extra fabric. And then I took those 2 layers and laid it on top of my backing, which is that linen sheet that I mentioned I had thrifted. And I am just flattening everything out, making sure everything is nice and smooth and lined up. And then I followed the cut of my batting for the backing as well. So giving myself a little extra fabric to work with. This next part was one of my favorite parts, I think, just because it was fun to me, which was basting the layers of the quilt together. So I just use this, I think it's like a 505 temporary adhesive is what it's called, I had on hand, and you just spray it onto the fabric, and then once you throw it in the wash, it will dissipate or wash away. But yeah, basically you just spray it on and just make sure that your layers are laying flat, and you kind of just create the sandwich, and it will keep it stuck together so that it doesn't move around when you're hand quilting. I also just wanted to like double enforce this by adding some safety pins. And then this other part was another favorite part of mine, which was creating my hand quilting design or lines. And I use this Hera knife is what I believe it's called. It's basically like a plastic knife, and you can just create lines using a ruler or some sort of straight edge. And so you'll see here the design that I went with is putting the stitch right through each smaller patch. And then next was starting the hand stitching process, which again was probably another one of my favorites. I feel like this whole project was my favorite, but I really did enjoy hand stitching this quilt, and I was so eager that I think I finished it in 2 days, a day and a half. And I just remember those days, like any chance that I had, like any free time I had, I pulled this out, and it's just a great way to like pass time. And the kids were playing around me, and I was just working on my quilt. And you'll see here the stitching that I'm doing. You can really, do whatever you want as far as like how spaced out you want the stitches to be, how close you want them to be, how long, how short. I'm using this sashiko thread that I got off of Amazon with the coordinating needle, and I just love this kind of exposed thread look. I think it just makes it so cute and cozy, and it also will add to the texture and the crinkle of the quilt once you wash it. This thread is 100% cotton as well, so really lovely to work with. If you have a thimble or if you can get one, I would recommend it for this part. I did not have one, but you are kind of repeating the same motion and can get some marks on your fingers from doing that. I removed the safety pins, and then I kind of just examined the edges, and now is the part where you will cut off the excess of the batting and the back fabric. So I'm using my cutting board as a straight edge, and then just using my fabric scissors to cut along the actual edge of the top quilt and remove all of that excess fabric. Next up is the binding and creating that. This is probably like the most tedious part for me. You have to create a binding that's long enough to go around the edge of your entire quilt. Sometimes you will have to do like a diagonal stitch like I'm doing here to create the full length of your binding if your fabric is not long enough. So that's what I'm doing here, and I will link a video below that I used to learn how to do this, but it's fairly easy, so it just takes some time. And after that, the next step is to fold your binding in half and iron it all the way through. After you've done that, you open it up, fold both edges toward the middle or into the middle, and then you fold it in half again and iron. And there are tools out there, I believe on Amazon, that you can buy that you can feed your binding fabric through, and it will create that folded finished look for you, and you just iron it. And then once my binding was complete, I was so excited to attach it to my quilt. You basically sew right sides together, and then that finished edge of the binding will fold over to the back side, and then you'll hand stitch it closed. So just showing you guys a little preview of what it's looking like here. I also wanted to include this clip here to show you guys like some realistic parts of doing a project for the first time. So the edge of my quilt here got a little wonky. I think just the way that I was pulling the thread when I was hand stitching made the edge of the quilt not as straight, and so when I sewed on the binding, it didn't catch this edge, so I had to seam rip and re-sew that portion of the binding onto the quilt. And you'll see here it's a little wonky, it's not straight, but we love imperfections with handmade projects, and that's totally okay. Next up is actually closing the raw edge of the quilt by finishing off the back of the binding, and I use clips to just hold it in place exactly where I want it to be sewn, and that made it so much easier. And now I'm just working on hand stitching it closed, and so this was another fun part, just taking it really slow and doing it at night. And I just used a slip stitch, I believe is what you call it. Basically, you start under the binding and you pull your needle through as closely along the edge of the binding as possible, and then you backstitch doing the same thing and just repeat that process. Again, I will include resources below that I use to do this technique or to learn this technique. Here's a quick close-up of what that stitch looks like. Again, I totally understand why people love quilting now, because it's such a relaxing thing to do. Like, you can just turn on a podcast or listen to music or even sit in silence, and just forces you to slow down and focus on what you're working on with your hands. And I really found myself enjoying the process while working on this project. This is actually a clip of me finishing the quilt off, and to do that I just made a knot by wrapping the thread around it a couple times and then pulling it through to create a knot. And I made sure to create that knot under the binding so that it's not exposed. I just love how this quilt turned out. It's so special to me. This is definitely one of those pieces that I hope to keep in my family for years to come, and it was definitely a project that was well worth it and something I'm really proud of. And I'm so excited to use this blanket with my baby boy. I hope that this video inspired you to want to try something new and create something with your hands. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you guys in my next video. Bye.